Welcome to The Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or at thetwotestaments.com. Follow us on Twitter at @2testaments or ask questions in our Facebook group.
Welcome to the Two Testaments podcast, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Ronnie Cosman.
And I'm Will Kynes.
And in this episode, we're looking at Job chapter 28, the majestic hymn to wisdom. And we're joined today by Dr. Scott Jones.
Now, Scott is professor of biblical studies at Covenant College. And I noticed, Scott, I was looking at your website there at the college, and you mentioned that you like watching British mysteries. You ever watch Endeavor? I think Endeavor is the one that's set in Oxford.
I liked Endeavor a lot, yes. And I can't remember, was that or was it his predecessor? And I can't remember all the names, but there was the one previous to Endeavor, and then there was one previous to that. So there was Morse. And
Inspector Morse, yeah.
And Lewis, and then Endeavor. Anyway, but yeah, I think there was a joke at some point about Oxford and the setting of Oxford for the Morse and things, and that it would seem that Oxford was the murder capital of the world based on that show.
I actually, when I taught at Oxford, I had a student who told me that he loved watching those, but that it made him nervous to come to Oxford as a student because a person would die every week in Oxford.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't just bring you on here to talk about British mysteries, although I do always appreciate the little details that faculty put up on their websites. It's hard to.
Well, I have to put something. I mean, some people put like what kind of wine they like or something, but something a little personal.
Right. At least you didn't just put, I like reading books.
Of course, I knew I couldn't do that.
Behind you.
I knew I couldn't do that.
Yeah, you clearly do like reading books, but and Job, I think, is a particular book that you seem to enjoy reading. In fact, you have written books about Job. So you have Rumors of Wisdom, Job 28 as poetry, which is the reason why we thought of you to come on and help us walk through Job 28. But you also have written the entry on Job in the Oxford Handbook of Wisdom and the Bible, which
edited by Will Kynes.
Yes. Okay.
Which has a great cover, and I'm very way to go finding that.
Yes, I actually found this cover from was an art dealer in Israel who they kindly gave OUP permission to put that on the cover.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
For those of you who can't see, you just have to go out and check the OUP website. But it's this dark and moody painting of Kohelet.
Yeah. Will is very good at finding covers for his books.
Yeah.
His Obituary for Wisdom Literature is also a nice cover book.
Wow. Been far too much time.
See that cover right there?
Yeah, it's a nice cover. Good job, Will.
Yeah, thanks. But I do want to, besides talking about the cover of the book, what's inside is probably even more valuable. And in fact, Scott's chapter on Job, I just thought was a very clear and comprehensive introduction to Job. And it's difficult to be comprehensive with Job while being clear. But for our listeners who are looking for, you just want, the book of Job in 20 pages or so, I strongly recommend Scott's chapter in this book. But you also, for the listener who wants to dig even deeper into Job, Scott's working on the Job commentary in the Old Testament Library series, which I think is a fantastic series. Now, how long is the listener going to have to wait until they get an opportunity to read that?
Well, the due date is about 10 years from now.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And that's the due date. So
we'll see.
So it might be 20, 30 years after.
Just be patient. In the meantime, there are plenty of good commentaries on Job. But yes, Job has a way, and it has a way of, I don't feel like I'm working on Job as much as Job is working on me. And it takes you, and that's how you sort of get stuck. It can sound negative. I don't really mean it negative, and it can feel like that. It can be maddening. But I recently heard someone talk about some epic process of Bible translation for a new version that's coming out soon. And they said this faculty of so-and-so did the whole Bible in a year. And I was like, and I thought, I can't even translate Job in a year. I don't know what they're looking at. But anyway.
It must be a different Bible.
They got a different Bible.
So Scott, we just talked about how you're doing this research on Job, and it's kind of in the process of consuming you, I guess. But what first drew you to Job? Was there any personal connection you had with the book, or is it just an intellectual interest?
Well, this is once again one of the answers that probably seems too pedestrian. Everybody would like a better answer than this, but it is largely because one of my close supervisors in doctoral work was moving into working on Job. Uh-huh. And there was a seminar in our first year of coursework in Princeton Seminary on philology and text criticism, various things like this. And we were encouraged to pick texts that would bear some kind of really in-depth study. Mm-hmm. And so the teacher of that seminar, Liang Xiao, recommended maybe this chapter. So that was my first semester, and got into researching this chapter my first semester. At the time, I didn't think I was going to work on Job. I think I went in maybe thinking I would do something on Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, but it came back around for time for dissertation proposal and the like. And folks there encouraged me to continue with that. So some of it is very practical. I did really enjoy it. I loved it. But some of it is just, you should do this. And I said, okay.
Sure. But little did you know what you were getting into at that point.
Right.
And now, Scott, how do you see Job chapter 28, this hymn to wisdom, how do you see it fitting in the book of Job as a whole?
Well, as you know, and I think the reason that you asked the question was because many people don't see it fitting. I wonder, as you asked the question, I wonder how much that's a scholarly point of view. For example, if I just handed someone the book of Job, mm-hmm. I wonder if everyone would come away thinking, wow, that chapter 28 sure is strange and weird and it doesn't fit. Now, maybe they would. Obviously, people have thought that for a long time. It's not something someone just made up. And then that makes me wonder how much people start to think it doesn't fit because they're told that it doesn't fit.
Why do some scholars think it doesn't fit in the book?
Exactly. There is, and even the way that, you asked the question about calling it a hymn, mm-hmm. people will call it a hymn or a chorus or a meditation or something, and it all suggests that it is some sort of break in tone. Okay. From what is previous, and that it becomes maybe meditative at this point. As you know, the book is structured around these very heated debates. And at this point in the book, these debates are starting to fizzle out and become ever stranger because certain characters are saying things that sounded like something they wouldn't have said a couple of minutes back. And so then you get this chapter 28, and it just seems to have a different voice than what's previous. And I think that's the main reason that people see it as something that may have been added later. And there are various scholars who believe that. Some more recent views by David Kynes and Ed Greenstein have suggested that it has become displaced from a textual, rummaging around of folios, and it belongs even later with Elihu. But there are just about as many theories about where it goes as you could imagine. And I think that main reason of tone and subject matter that's probably the main reason why people see it as odd.
Yeah. Well, and also it seems to be fairly self-contained. One of the reasons people argue you could put it in different places is because you could put it in different places. I mean, it doesn't seem to just flow out of the chapter before it or lead into the chapter.
It sits on its own really nicely. Yeah. But so, how do you see it fitting into the book as a whole?
I suppose I could answer that question in different ways. There have been folks who see it less, that are worried less about who's it assigned to. Is it Zophar, for example? Michael Fox has argued that it's really Zophar's speech. Or is it Job, or is it so-and-so, and does it belong between 27 and 29? Carol Newsom has talked about it being almost like like a voice behind the curtain sort of thing from the author. And I think that's a really interesting viewpoint in that it definitely ties back to the larger structure of the book that begins with a prologue, so-called, or an opening narrative that focuses on the fear of God and turning from evil, which of course is prominent at the end of 28. And so that's more at a very big level, a meta level, like something that is not just about these particulars of who spoke it, but that it is integrated almost in the mind of the editor or in the mind of the author. So that answers your question, and it doesn't answer your question in a way, right? I do think that it fits with the theology of Job as a whole, at least as far as I understand it. I don't know how it relates to a speaker, whether that be Job or Zophar or Elihu or any others, like with certainty, but I also have no evidence to the contrary that it doesn't fit. It's definitely odd. But it would certainly be helpful if any of these speculations were able to be substantiated by appeal to any kind of evidence anywhere at all.
Right.
And I'm not saying that means that it's not true. I'm just saying that it's speculation. And so in those cases, I tend to default to trying to explain it where it is without trying to be dogmatic about it.
Sure. Now, we'll probably get into this in more depth later, but I want to follow up on what you just said about how this chapter contributes to the theology of the book as a whole. How do you see that working out?
Well, this essentially sounds like what is your idea of the theology of Job question? Right? I mean, fair, because once again, I find it difficult to speak with one synthetic voice on the matter. And of course, as you know, scholars have talked about Job and theology being something that arises out of multiple voices, and that in fact is the employment of multiple voices. So answering the question can be quite difficult in that one simply doesn't give an abstract statement about the theology of the book of Job teaches X.
Right.
I think that this is where you see other bits of the book at tension with one another, and why people have also argued that other bits of the book, say, for example, the opening narrative or the closing narrative or the Elihu speeches, for example, seem to not fit as well. Because I think what we're finding is that the bits don't go together in a way that produces a single statement summary. So if I can be a bit more traditional for a minute, I would probably say that a lot of what Job teaches us is about the relationship between wisdom and fear of the Lord. It is about, it's sort of a dramatic irony of an audience knowing something about something that Job may be going through that Job doesn't know. The friends of Job think they know and they don't know, and Job thinks he knows and he doesn't know. And so there's a lot of assumption on everyone's part about what's going on and why, only to find out at the end, depending on how you characterize the God speeches at the end between 38 and 41, that it's really sort of sounds like none of those reasons is correct, at least if that narrative is something that we should heed and listen to and think that that's really what God is saying in 38 to 41. And he sort of sounds like I'm doing this for, crazy reasons, kind of like ostrich reasons, or Leviathan reasons. And you're just like, okay. And then Job is, depending on how you characterize it, either willing to submit to that and humble himself, or he's been silenced by God's power, or whatever people say, right? So at the very least, if I were abstracting, I would say that it does teach us about what we think we know about the relationship between fear of God, obedience, serving the Lord, and terrible tragedy and evil befalling us, and what all that means. And I don't believe that the book of Job is working to say that every possible answer that we've ever given for those things is wrong, but I do think it challenges the assumption that we could give an answer, and maybe some of the answers are basically like category mistakes or something like that.
Right. So the book as a whole undercuts human confidence because we have all these different voices and it's hard to say which one is right. And one of the things that's happening throughout the book is people are shown to be wrong. We know right from the beginning that we as readers know a lot of stuff that they don't know. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately God claims knowledge for himself that no one can know. Yep. So we need to be somewhat chaste as interpreters, claiming we know what the book is all about. And Job 28 is making a similar kind of point in miniature about the limits of human knowledge.
And so that's it's really helpful the way you put that. I think it helps me because I do think that in a way, perhaps, depending on how you characterize Job 28, it could be, as you say, part of the biggest part of some of its theology in miniature. Yeah.
Scott, who do you think is speaking in Job chapter 28?
I have treated it as Job's voice. I certainly understand the arguments that there are things that are being said here that don't seem to fit very well with the kinds of things or the kind of tone Job has spoken with previously. I understand Michael's argument, for example, about assigning it to Zophar, and Ed's argument about Elihu and these kinds of things. Those make sense. I suppose that I am just a little bit less adventurous in reassigning those things with a lack of data. And as I said, I don't think that means that they're necessarily wrong. It's just not something that I would normally do. So I have made a try at reading it as Job's words. And I think that it can make sense as Job's words, to me, at least, just about as well as it can make sense as anyone else's words. But of course, that's something that others will have to decide.
Right. And to make it make sense as Job's words, people will try different things. Like, some will argue, I think this is Allison Lowe, who says, it's this kind of interlude where Job is kind of taking a break, stepping back from his suffering and thinking about it from the outside. Some people will say, this actually resonates with people who are suffering. There are times in the midst of suffering where we're able to step outside and analyze it. How do you help it make sense within the context of what Job has gone through?
Way back when, which is, I guess, not way back, but it's kind of a while ago. When was that? 2007 or 8 or something. I treated it largely as Job's response to his friends who claimed to know about wisdom by searching out the tradition. And so his retort here would be characterizing his friends in the first, basically the first third of the chapter, as these who claim to have searched, the ends of the earth and found wisdom, and really they don't have it, because the first third is really more about where wisdom can't be found than where it can be found. Yeah. That's one approach I've taken. I still think that's quite possible. Another way I've approached it in an article on modern theology and modern epistemology is as presenting two different allegories about the nature of knowledge and wisdom, and that is less tied to who the speaker is than it is simply what I think the theology or epistemology that I can say this chapter teaches. But if I'm answering the question in the way you posed it, I think I would probably go back to that original thinking that that Job is basically making a mockery of what he thinks his friends have said to have obtained and claimed to know.
Okay. Now, in your book on Job 28, you dig pretty deeply into the ancient Near Eastern context, the background of this text. How does doing that help us understand what's going on?
The issue that with that narrative, and the narrative is that this first 11 verses, 12 verses really is less about mining process than it is about a journey of an ancient kind of first explorer to some fantastical region out beyond the border of civilization to find precious treasure, is that it cuts against the grain of all of the translations that people have. And so then that leaves a lot of questions. There are not only questions about why would you do that or what the background is, but also like, well, what do I do with this translation? Or why are what does this mean? This is a bad translation or something like that. And I'm very sensitive to those things. I don't, not normally one of those that I don't enjoy telling people their Bible is wrong or they don't really know, or normally that's just not the case. But what I saw as I studied that poem and as I began to try to figure out how the language might be understood in a different sort of paradigm was looking at the words of the poem in Hebrew. I mean, this is what we all are, working to do or trained to do. And in several cases, probably 4 or 5 cases within those first 11 verses or so, there are words or phrases that if you were to look in any dictionary, there would be a special meaning for the use of the word in Job 28. That is, everywhere else it means this, but in Job 28 it means this. Okay, right. That's certainly possible. That's not impossible. Things happen like that. But I became a little bit. I was like, well, why is it so special? Is it because we have evidence to the otherwise, or to the contrary, or is it because people don't really know what to do and they're kind of making something up? And that's all possible too, because we frankly don't know a lot about the ancient Near East. I mean, we can say we do and we don't. So I think kind of what I've learned in my way of engaging the Hebrew text or the Aramaic text, as the case may be, is to try to let the word be the most common version of itself until proven otherwise. There are absolutely specialized meanings of words. Absolutely there are. But what I began to find is that when I did that, that's when I felt like the metaphors that I had thought I had discovered, though I don't hopefully claim to be, this great adventurer and find new things that no one's seen before, made sense.
Why don't we read through the first 6 verses? Are some of the words that you're looking at reading in different ways?
Yep.
Are they lie in the first 6 verses?
Yeah, the first, especially 10.
Okay.
But yeah, verse 1, verse 4, right. Verse 10, verse 11.
So let me read that. In verse 1 begins, surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold to be refined. Iron is taken out of the earth and copper is smelted from ore. Miners put an end to darkness and search out to the farthest bound the ore in gloom and deep darkness. They open shafts in a valley away from human habitation. They are forgotten by travelers. They sway suspended. I mean, I imagine like harnessed or something like that.
Yeah, you totally do. Right.
Yeah, they sway suspended, remote from people. As for the earth, out of it comes bread, yada, yada, yada. We go on to verse 10.
Yeah, 10 and 11, right?
They cut out channels in the rocks, and their eyes see every precious thing. The sources of the rivers they probe, hidden things they bring to light. So tell me a little bit about how you saw this was read and translated, and some of the words, and then how you kind of landed on the other way to read it.
Yeah. If you were to look up that word in verse 1, motza, that is translated there as mine.
Okay.
We're talking about motza being something like a place of departure. It's an exit, right? It's something that something comes out of. And it's like it's used of springs or a point of origin or something like that. So you might even think of something like what if we said there was a spring of silver, and you think, well, that's weird. What does that mean? Like, I don't know. I agree. I mean, but it's kind of like a Big Rock Candy Mountain type of thing or something like this. It's like, that's really actually kind of closer to what's going on in the text, I think. But we don't know what that is. And then we think, well, it must be like a mine. Well, that makes sense. He's talking about ore and metals and things. So we're going to use what we know. And we're like, well, it's a mine. Okay. Well, once that's been decided, and that's not an unreasonable extension, then we start going with this whole thing about mining. Well, then you get to verse 3, NRSV, miners put an end to darkness. So there's no noun as a subject in that verse. It just says he. And it's interesting. So one of the things I do, I don't normally talk about this chapter a lot to my undergraduate students, but there's one occasion in one class that I do, and I give them parallel translations of ESV and NRSV just because they kind of work. And I just tell them to show me where the differences are. And ESV right there says man puts an end to darkness, which is still an imposition because the text doesn't say man. It just says he. It's actually so ambiguous that in verse 3 and following some traditions, and I think Ed Greenstein may think this as well, think that the subject of the whole first third of the chapter is God, not man and humans at all, which shows you how flexible that can be. So, so miners put an end to darkness, and they search out the ore and this and that. Verse 4 is especially difficult. So you get this, NRSV says shafts. So if you really look at that, it's a nachal or nachalim. Normally those are, it's like a wadi that is either dry or fills with water quickly. It could be used of a burial, these kinds of things. Well, then you get this other bits of this verse, and this is probably the hardest part of the poem in this second part. They are forgotten by travelers. They sway suspended remote from people. And so our mind, we've decided it's a miner. We decided it's a shaft. We've decided that they're swaying suspended. The word is dalal, is dangle, like in Proverbs is used of dangling legs of the disabled legs, and these kinds of, or dangling curls, like the name Delilah, right? And so we just like, well, this must be like they're going down a vertical mine shaft, and they're, like you said, running as a harness or something like this, right? Well, sure, it's possible if they ever did any mining like that. And that was part of the issue, is like, I'm not saying it, that I know enough to tell you for sure that never happened, but I'm looking in evidence for mining is certainly vertical mining that way. I don't think there's any evidence that ever happened at all, ever in that time. So these are one of these things where I'm starting to think, this could make some sense, but it could also just be, we're doing our best and we all have to do this in translation. We're providing a frame, right? And then you go down, as you said, down to cutting out channels in the rocks. Could that just be cutting out a mountain pass, or could it just be cutting a mining shaft, right? And depends on what you're thinking. And then verse 11, the sources of the rivers they probe. That's an interesting one, especially when you compare it to ESV. He dams up the streams so they do not trickle. And you're like, well, that's really different. So ESV is being wooden to the Masoretic text. And NRSV is actually using Ugaritic. And some phrases in Ugaritic about the dwelling place of the high god Ale in near Kirbet Afka and others, to say that they think that's what you find that in your little notes right there in the VHS. So there's another problematic issue, but the sources of the rivers is very likely in the ancient Near Eastern way of thinking. As I mentioned, the Canaanite high god Ale is said to dwell at the sources of the rivers and streams amidst the double deep. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of at the very least, there's some sort of a mythology, right, being assumed here, I think. I don't know how much every listener or reader of Job would have known that. I don't know. Job, in fact, I wonder how much anyone would know much of anything about what Job assumes. It's so, in a way, it's so intellectual, and there's so much going on. And you just think, like, I don't think this is written for just a regular person, But at the same time, I don't think it has to do anything to do with damming up streams so they don't trickle. But I've heard people explain that as to, well, there would be water in the mine shafts, and so they have to be, So I'm not trying to poke fun at anyone by doing that, but it is just to show how much our translations, especially when we really don't know what model these are composed on, how much they're relying on us providing mental paradigms. And so my goal was simply to provide another one that might make sense, not to try to say, it's the only right way or anything, but just to say, well, what about this? Does this make sense? And of course, I think that it makes just as much sense or more, but not everyone does. So
you're, instead of our modern view of what mining is, where people they use dynamite and explode out channels, and they dangle down on with their carabiners and harnesses and everything. You're suggesting, well, maybe that's a modern imposition on this imagery, which is hard to interpret in the first place. And you found this ancient Near Eastern parallel in Gilgamesh. So, Gilgamesh traveling out and exploring new lands. And there is a lot of kind of language of gems and jewels and so on. Yeah. So then we get to the payoff question, which is, So besides just perhaps more accurately translating this verse according to what the original author had in mind, rather than our own image of what is being described here, how does that help us understand the message? Is there a difference in the message if we have that paradigm in mind that you've discovered rather than the one that many people use?
Yeah, I do think the message, in terms of, like you said, you use the word payoff, or the theology, is not radically different. I think still you have humans that through technological prowess are attempting to grasp at something through technique and to take it as an object. That could be, on the one hand, that could be mining. On the other hand, that could be the first discoverer, the Gilgamesh quest for knowledge kind of thing. I think that there is perhaps a qualitative difference if you nestle it inside of this first discoverer narratives, because they are, those are very common throughout Mesopotamian literature, Sumerian and Akkadian, and kings are always claiming to be first discoverers. So they'll often claim to have reached the sources of the rivers, and they've gone up to Lake Urmia, Lake Van, and up in the Hittite territories, and they've seen what no one has seen before, and that makes them the greatest. So I think that it's not a radical departure from someone who engages in mining technology to find something to treat as an object to be grasped. But I do think it is more based on the claim of an individual who takes pride in and values, in this case, his grasping at, basically, or to use Star Trek, going where no man has gone before, so that he can say that he's done what and has what no one else has. And I really think that is one of the easiest this is not so much to the payoff as, again, back to the model. The easiest connections to make is with the ways that we treat outer space and have for a long time. So it's less about going down into the earth and things get dark as you go out. And as you go out from things that are civilized or things that you know about, things become strange. And they're Martians and all these kinds of things, right? Now, it used to be that would be true even on maps of the world, right? There would be no one's been here, and here there are cannibals here, and these kinds of things. Well, since we claim to have conquered the world now, which of course we humans have not, but it just gets moved to outer space, and then you have the same narrative over again. You go out in the darkness, and they're the Martians, and then you find this precious treasure, and you reach Mars, and then whatever you know, you're the best in the universe. So I do think at least it gets a little bit perhaps more at the intention of what is going on with the human subject, and I tend to take it as a human subject in going on this journey and trying to grasp this precious thing. And that's part of the reason I so recommend Gilgamesh so highly, is I think that the entire Gilgamesh epic speaks to the exact same thing, the exact same theology as Job 28.
Great. Scott, in verse 12, we read, "But where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding?" Now, that's a kind of refrain in the chapter that happens again in verse 20. What's the answer that the poem gives to those questions? Where is wisdom to be found?
When it poses the question that way, of course, it makes it sound like it's in a place. And I think what we find out and what the poem does later on, especially starting in verse 23, is that it's not as much about locating it as an object in a place through a technique as it is as a part of a creative act that can only be enacted by the divine. So I think the way that the poem answers it is it begins this so-called answer in verse 23. God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. Well, of course, it still uses the place metaphor. Okay, it's in a place. But then it tells you that he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. Oh, look. Yep. When he gave to the wind its weight and apportioned out the waters by measure, he made a decree for the rain and a way of the thunderbolt. Then he saw it and declared it. So when he was in the midst of weighing the wind and apportioning the waters and dealing with the rain and the thunderbolt is when he saw it. It sounds to me like he's making a storm. And then he saw wisdom during that act. And he established it and searched it out, which is interesting because it's almost God becomes the searcher, the prober of wisdom. But it can only be found in the creative act of apportioning and weighing out the elements of the cosmos. And you think, well, I can't really do that. And I think that's exactly what the poem is saying. And then at that time, he said, and this NRSV says, to humankind, truly the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. And then there's the question as to whether that's really the answer or whether it's a big cop-out. And that's, people have a lot of problems with that because they'll say, well, it looks like there was this really magnificent poem that was so evocative, and then it ended with this just terribly trite and pedestrian answer of just like obeying. And it's like Proverbs or something, gross like that, according to kind of their attitude. I think that a lot of our displeasure about that is, again, once kind of our presumptions about what's going on, and we want something more sophisticated than that, and really this is just taking a nice sophisticated poem and giving us some elementary school teaching or something. And it does seem to me that the fear of the Lord is one of those concepts that can be as simplistic or as profound as you'd like to make it. And I think that the way we characterize that verse can sometimes mirror how we ourselves think about what the fear of the Lord is. And of course, how we've been brought up and where we've heard the phrase and our, all those kinds of things. It seems to me to argue for that, that type of submission and obedient submission that Job is praised for at the beginning of the book. And interestingly, if Job is the speaker of this, he's simply told us something that God has said to humans, or the humankind, or the man, with some debate about who that is, that actually matches what Job already is. So he has wisdom, if that's the case. In that sense that I mentioned before, that perhaps this poem is an allegory of two different ways of understanding the world, I think that it does take us back to a different way of understanding our modern tendencies, at least here in the West, have been to praise our own exploits and technologies, and how through human ingenuity we can conquer the world. And I'm certainly not against human ingenuity. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I do think that this poem may suggest that without proper humility and understanding one's place in the grand scheme of things, the cosmos as created and governed by God, and submitting to that governance, that one's possible boasting, hubris based on one's achievements is misplaced and dangerous, and that that could go terribly wrong. So there's some ideas about kind of how I think that works.
I mean, I think it's fascinating what you just said as a parallel to the research that you did on how to translate the first 11 verses, right? So scholars come along and they're pretty confident that they can translate this really difficult and obscure imagery. But what they're actually producing is a translation that reflects their own way of seeing the world, which surprisingly has a lot to do with human ingenuity and technology and our ability to, and you're suggesting, well, maybe we should be a little bit more humble and take our translation of this text from the ancient context from which it emerged, and acknowledge we may not understand it directly. So there's this, even the study of this text, and I think we see this all the time with Job, is it has the effect on us as readers that it's trying to communicate in its message.
Yeah, I do think that, and it is humbling. And I remember in one of the PhD seminars in doctoral work, we had this get-togethers with all the faculty and the students, and sometimes one professor in particular, we kind of poke fun at another one for bringing his NJPS Tanakh that had English on one side and Hebrew on the other. He should just have his Hebrew Bible, and it was lighthearted and good natured. But the one responded is like, yeah, well, if you were doing Job, you would too. And I think that all the time. I mean, I'm working through it. Like, I mean, I'm not claiming to be the best in the world at Hebrew or anything. I know kind of what I'm doing, and Job will make you feel like you don't. So you're just like, well, sure, I'm glad I have this English translation right here, and I'm working pretty hard at it. So yeah, I do think that maybe that's a part of what Job does for us in general, in I don't know. That sort of answer. So what's Job about? I mean, here are some kinds of things, but I don't know. Or even with Bible translation. And I know that's difficult for students. Students want to know, what do you think about this? Or what do you think? And I know they must be disappointed. And I try not to do it too much or be too cavalier, but sometimes it's like, I have no idea. I don't know what Paul's talking about in this. How could you possibly know? That's crazy. I don't know. I mean, you can make some good guesses, but I feel like that's the way that all of these things kind of work, and especially some of those works like Job, is you find out the deeper you get, the less you feel you know, and that maybe that's part of
and that's kind of what Job 28 is saying, right? I mean, if we take the mining imagery, the deeper they dig into the earth, they don't get any closer to wisdom.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe if they dug all the way down and saw that wisdom was definitively not there, they would realize that that was a fool's errand from the beginning. So let's talk about one more thing, which is, and you've kind of alluded to this, but the description of wisdom here. So truly the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom in verse 28, and to depart from evil is understanding. If we've read through the book from the beginning, we've heard those phrases before. Right? This is the way that Job was described all the way at the beginning of the book. What do you think the significance is of that?
It may possibly tell us that Job's initial, his description, which is much like Abraham's description in some respects, is still the ideal. I don't know that.
What's the description of Abraham you have in mind?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, a God-fearer, the consummate God-fearer. So that in early Judaism, there was sometimes a debate about who was the consummate God-fearer. Was it Abraham or was it Job? And most of the time, maybe it depends on who you asked. I'm trying to think of who won. I think maybe Abraham won on that one. But the idea is that fear of the Lord connection and turning from evil connection, you see that certainly in the Akadon narrative and others, that Abraham was, now I know that you fear God and these kinds of things. That maybe it's a refrain back to what was noted at the very beginning. I don't know that necessarily means that it's saying Job never should have launched into his tirade in chapter 3. I'm not sure that that's what that suggests. But beyond the fact that it's a circling back to some of the vision of the opening narrative. I'm not exactly sure what I would say that it teaches us about Job. I think I know what it teaches about wisdom, but to your specific question, I don't know how I'd answer that.
Do you have a thought, Will?
Well, I guess a lot of it has to do with whether if we see this as on Job's lips.
Yes, right.
Right. Then he understands what wisdom is here at the end of chapter 28. The description we had of him was from the narrator. It wasn't him.
Yeah, that's true. And he doesn't know that. We think he doesn't know that.
Right. But we see that he has internalized the nature of wisdom here to some degree. But if it's not on Job's lips, then some people, think it's the narrator. It could be the narrator once again reminding us, hey, Job is still a good guy. Here we are in chapter 28, after all that he said.
Right.
Hey, remember how I described him at the beginning? This still seems to fit for him. Or maybe you could read it exactly the opposite, and the narrator saying, hey, this is what wisdom is supposed to be, but look at what we saw Job do.
Or if it's Zophar, for example, if that verse gets included and it's Zophar is just unknowingly said that wisdom is exactly the way the narrator has described Job, sort of laughing at Zophar. So, Yeah.
And this is what you run into with Job all the time, which is that one interpretive decision depends on another.
Absolutely.
Which depends on another interpretive decision. And that's what keeps you and I employed, Scott, which is great.
But if you can, is one way to connect them is to say something. I'm the non-Joban expert, right? So I'm just throwing stuff out there because it's fun. But is one way to read it is then to say that, well, yeah, you can't do these expeditions to find wisdom, right? Because you're not going to be able to find wisdom. But if you fear the Lord, you have wisdom. And look, go back to Job chapter 1. Job has this fear of the Lord. So Job has this wisdom. Job has this wisdom that all the human expeditions could not attain. He has it. And would that be in contrast then to the friends who are themselves claiming to have some kind of wisdom to offer? Am I overreading now?
No, that's interesting. I think that sounds interesting. As if it were to put you in the company of Job in chapter 1. Now, it may be daunting if you think, well, when is the adversary going to go talk to God about me and all these kinds of things? But it would still be, you too could be in the company of Job if you can submit, that sort of thing. I like that.
Right. Yeah, I like it, Ronnie.
Okay.
Write it up. Well, to finish off our time, Scott, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken to walk us through this passage. We'd like to draw on the genre that biblical scholars seem to have perfected, the blurb.
Oh, yeah.
So do you have a blurb that you could share with us about? It could be a book, but it could also be anything else that you might recommend to our listeners that they might find helpful in their lives. We've had a number of different blurbs already this season. Brent Strawn recommended horse mats. If you want to set up a home gym, then use horse mats.
No, that's true. You go to the Tractor Supply and you get those, instead of the mats that it costs like way too much money, you go to the Tractor Supply because they have to. You get these rubber mats and it's way cheaper.
I did not know about
I didn't know Brent knew that either. I didn't know he was into equestrian stuff.
So anything you'd like to blurb for us?
Yes. Well, everyone has to read Gilgamesh, and I like this translation. That's Andrew George's translation, and it's a Penguin edition, so it's real cheap. It's not very expensive.
Right.
For Job, if you want to have your interest piqued and you're comfortable with something not being an ecclesial translation or a translation for a synagogue, a scholarly translation that is bound to have you interested and that is really brilliantly done. I really like Ed Greenstein's translation for that purpose. It's a very brilliant work. You just have to be willing to let it be an argument with all the other ones all the time. And that's a part of learning, and that's fun. And
Scott, let me just interrupt for a second. I'm glad that you mentioned that because it's a perfect segue. Our next episode will be with Ed Greenstein on chapters 29 to 31.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So listeners, opportunity to hear him in person, doing some of that debate with other interpreters.
Well, it's great. And I love Ed, and he's been very kind to me. And really, really happy with that and what he's done. And it's a good example. I mean, I don't think Ed agrees with my reading of the poem. I don't think I agree with everything Ed does. Since when's that the point?
Right.
It's not the point. We're friends. I love his work. I benefit from it. And he's told me that it's done the same for him. And I'm very grateful for that. And you will, no matter what happens or what you agree with or disagree, you will learn from Ed. It's great. I'm so glad to hear that. And then finally, if I may, this commentary on Jonah by Amy Erickson. This is the latest Illuminations commentary volume. And especially for anyone who is who thinks Jonah is a simple book, can find out that perhaps it's not as simple as we thought. And as you probably know, Jonah has a vast history of interpretation and reception. And this is a really well done and creative commentary. Again, bound to make you think, very provocative. I'm really proud of that. So, yeah.
Well, Scott, thanks for taking the time to guide us through Job chapter 28. You've taken us down the mine, and you're thankful for that. And
to the ends of the earth.
Either way, it's just dark there. I'm sorry. It's dark wherever we are.
I just got to pick a metaphor that works.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And to our listeners, if you went on this expedition, and you. Now I'm going to mix up the metaphor now, but if you did find wisdom on this expedition with Scott, Will, and I, well, please go to our website, thetwotestaments.com. There you can subscribe. Go to Facebook. You can find our Facebook group and our Facebook page. And please share this podcast with others. Go to wherever you subscribe to podcasts and give us whatever it is, a like. Whatever it is you do to subscribe and share and all those things. Ratings would be nice. We don't want the half star rating.
We'd prefer not to.
Or even 4. I mean, why 4? Like, be generous.
Go for gold.
Yeah. We'd like a 5-star rating. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The Two Testaments is produced with the support of Sanford University, where Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes are professors in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. Thanks to Joe Zellner, Jody McFarland, and the team in the Faculty Success Center, and our student assistants, Carson Knopf, Jake Maddox, Harrison Pike, and Gracie Plum, for their help with production, editing, and promotion.